Well, like some of you, I also have a hobby that I've grown to love. And that's salsa dancing. Just kidding. I do like watching salsa dancing for reasons probably only obvious to the men in the room, but that's a whole nother can of worms. Moving along. I would now like to introduce you to my real semester theme. Drum roll, please. Basketball. Now, some of you might be wondering, why not football or baseball or something? And the answer is simple. I'm not good at those things. Now, basketball was invented by a Canadian PE teacher in 1891 named James Naismith. The game was first played by dribbling a soccer ball up and down the court and trying to land the ball into a peach bucket, as if a hoop isn't difficult enough. It wasn't until later that same year, when I noticed my brother playing basketball, that I began to take interest in it. I started off shooting around with him at the park. Then I graduated to being his personal test dummy for new moves. But no worries, I would finally exact my revenge in the 7th grade, when I acquired enough skill to finally beat him. Not that I remember the score or anything, 11-5. Basketball began as a fun activity to do with my friends. As I grew older, I learned basketball had more benefits to it than I realized. Basketball kept me in good physical shape, was a great stress reliever, and most importantly, it allowed me to bond with my older brothers. Being that my older brothers are significantly older than I am, it was nice having something in common with them. Basketball is fine and dandy. That is, until something goes wrong. For those whose hobbies involve sports and other physical activities, you know firsthand the possibilities of injuries. For instance, injuries play a huge role in the careers of NBA players. One of the most common suffered injuries in the NBA is a sprain. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term, but for those who aren't, a sprain is a sudden twisting or wrenching of the joint or ligament. Although on rare occasions, severe sprains can be serious, the average sprain can be quite easily to doctor if you remember one thing: rice. When I say rice, I don't mean for you to begin a grain-induced diet. RICE is an acronym used to remember the procedure for treating a sprain: rest, ice, compression, elevation. One more time: rest, ice, compression, elevation. Good. While injuries can affect any basketball player, there is a highly controversial issue surrounding some of the newcomers to the NBA. This issue is whether or not prospects should be drafted into the NBA immediately after high school. After Spencer Haywood's case in 1970, the Supreme Court ruled that the players no longer had to graduate from college in order to be eligible for the NBA draft. This rule has changed a few times since 1970. As it stands now, according to the NBA Commission, players must be at least 19 years of age and be 1 year removed from high school in order to be eligible for the NBA draft. Is this fair? I'll leave that up for you to decide.